I had thought of just letting Catabasis be my only video up in this channel, but then I remembered there was one other book that I'd read that really had me roiled up because I couldn't just believe that this was an actual book. And it was the biggest plot convenience book if I ever read one. Like, the characters hardly had to do anything. It was just plot convenience after plot convenience that just carried them through. So I follow Cindy Famform with Cindy. If any of you guys have watched her videos, it's amazing. If you haven't, go watch it. And so I follow her on Instagram, and she had posted a screenshot of, I think, all the books she had read in that particular month, or it was a wrap up. And there were 2 books that she had rated as a 5-star read, and one of them was A Study in Drowning. I cannot remember if the other one was Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairy. And I remembered her caption was, the beginning was really slow, but once it got to third of the way through, the plot really picked up and the ending really bumped it up to a 5-star for her. And so I was really intrigued by it because I had never read anything from Eva Reid before, but I had seen that people thought that her adult books, The Wolf and the Woodsman and Juniper and the Thorn, people really liked Juniper and the Thorn. They had really good reviews about it. And Study in Drowning is supposed to be her first YA book, and then I read the synopsis of it and it sounded right up my alley. It had all these gothic vibes and literature and academic rivals, and I was like, oh. And so I read the book and oh boy, it was a different story entirely. There's really no proper structure to this video. It's just me ranting, but I'll go through the plot first and then do like specific topics like the characters or world building or the list of plot convenience that occurs in this story. Okay, I got this from Penguin Random House page, and so the summary goes something like this. Effie has always believed in fairy tales. She's had no choice. Since childhood, she's been haunted by visions of the Fairy King. She's found solace only in pages of Angharit, a beloved epic about a mortal girl who falls in love with the Fairy King and then destroys him. Effie's tattered copy is all that's keeping her afloat through her stifling first term in her prestigious architecture college. So when the late author's family announces a contest to design his house, Effie feels certain that this is her destiny. But Highgate Manor is an impossible task, a musty, decrepit estate on the brink of crumbling into a hungry sea. And when Effie arrives, she finds she isn't the only one who's made a temporary home there. Preston Hillary, a stodgy young literature scholar, is studying Myridine's papers and determined to prove her favorite author is a fraud. As the 2 rival students investigate the reclusive author's legacy, piecing together clues through his letters, books, and diaries, they discover that the house foundation isn't the only thing that can't be trusted. Dark forces, both mortal and magical, conspiring against them, and the truth may bring them both to ruin. Of course, the truth will lead them into ruin, just like every other YA novels. Also, fun fact, the name Myridin is a Welsh name, and it's the name of a bard who is primarily attributed to the Black Book of Carbenton and the Red Book of Hergus. Both of these are very important Welsh manuscripts. They're basically medieval poems. Myridin here is said to be the speaker of a few of the poems. His name, Myridin Wild. Wild here translates to wild, so he's Myridin the Wild. But he also has other names like Myridin Amorous, which is the name Eva Reid took. She just switched about Merlinus Caledonius and Merlinus Sylvestris. So it's Merlin of Caledonia and Merlin of the Wood. And Myridin is understood to be a blueprint for the character of Merlin from the Arthurian legend. Geoffrey of Monmouth, when he wrote The Matter of Britain, he based the wizard Merlin on this Welsh bard of Myridin Wild, because he's also said to be this madman and a recluse who's in the woods most of the time. And because Merlin eventually gets sealed in a rock by Vivian, who is said to be, in the Arthurian legend, Merlin's apprentice. Some people consider her a different character, but other people consider her to be Vivian of the Lady of the Lake. So she learns magic from him, and eventually she's the one who seals him in his cave. Also, I've noticed that a lot of the names of characters in this book refers to names from the Celtic myth, specifically from the Welsh side of the Celtic myths. Coming back to A Study in Drowning, before we start each of the chapters, they're sort of preceded by an epigraph of the titular book in the story itself called Angharet, or bits and pieces of text from the world itself. So sometimes it's like a newspaper article or an article written by a scholar or bits of reviews and such. So I find those parts really interesting, and I think they're the only part in the entire story that was interesting. So we start the chapter with Effie finding the poster for a competition, and it's a redesign of Pirate Manor. And Pirate Manor is the home of the late author Emrys Myridin. To me, this was like the biggest plot convenience of the entire story. I'll tell you what I mean when we get further into the story. So we learn that Effie is in architecture school because the literature school, which is what she really wanted to get into, doesn't really allow women to study, which, okay. Because the way Effie later describes the schools, it seems like they are part of a larger university. And so my question is, why are women not allowed to study literature but she's allowed to study architecture? And we also get to mention that she's the only woman in the whole class. Effie tells us later that the only reason she got into architecture school because she scored high enough to get into it. But you would think that if this school is part of a larger university, regardless of what school, if women are not allowed to study one school, I am sure they are not going to be allowed to study any other school in that university. She doesn't say why women aren't allowed to study literature in this world. And the reason why I call this part of a plot convenience is because this is how she is supposed to meet her rival, the character Preston, which is very ironic because we don't meet him until a couple of chapters later, and he's not even in the university. And it's really funny that this book is described as rivals to lovers, but they're not even in the same academic sphere or even studying the same academic subject. So I don't understand how this can be described as a rivals to lovers. They're not even rivaling on anything. Also, another thing this book is described as is a dark academia novel, which does not make sense because there's no academia is even involved. Like, they're not even rivaling on anything, let alone academia. So where is this dark academia trope even coming into? It would be more accurate to describe this book as a gothic mystery because that's what the whole story hinges on. It's this mystery of whether Myridin really wrote the works that he did or did someone else write them. But to describe it as a dark academia, it doesn't make sense at all. I mean, I can see this clearly as a publisher's ploy to sell this book as a dark academia book, but Ava Reid is the one who describes it like that. Like, just because your character wears a black ribbon and cardigan and black stockings and looks scholarly does not make it dark academia. Already, the world doesn't make sense. The character relationship to each other doesn't make sense. And we haven't even finished chapter 1. This is still chapter 1. And then Effie mentioned something about a master carbonic, and it's never really clearly stated what really happens, but we do get an indication that it's probably sexual abuse. Right after Effie reads the poster, she goes off to the library to pick out a book on that author, Myridin. She wants to read on his biography to sort of get a feel of how best she can redesign this house. And she asks the librarian the book she wants to check out, and the librarian says that all the book on Myridin has already been checked out. She gets annoyed about it and she asks who took it out, and the librarian says it's a boy named Preston Hillary. And she's like, that sounds like an Argentine name. And I'm like, what? That feels a bit racist, because how is it when the first thing you hear someone's name is their race? Also, in this world, there's some sort of political tension that's going on between these two countries. So we have the Illyrian and Argentine. Effie is Illyrian and Preston is an Argentine. So they're both warring with each other for... we still don't know why. They're just warring with each other. And so she's a bit prejudiced towards Argentine. And it does make her a bit of a racist. Like, how is it the moment you hear someone's name, the first thing you think about is their race or their nationality? It's a bit ridiculous. And just like I complained about R.F. Kuang's Ketabas, is how the two main characters are supposed to be rivals. Because of that, they do hate each other for no apparent reason. And this clearly applies to this story as well. You know, after the librarian says that, you know, this person borrowed the book, she immediately is like, oh, I hate this person. He's borrowed every book of my favorite author and I will never forgive him about it. And I'm like, girl, calm down. This is a library. He's a literature student. He has more needs to study those books compared to you. And this is a library. It's for everyone in the university to use. Just because someone borrowed a book you wanted doesn't make them your mortal enemy for it. Like, it's so ridiculous. And then because she cannot get this book that she wants, she goes into this rant about how it's so unfair that he gets all this book because he's a literature student and he gets to study literature and she can't because she's a woman, and that life is unfair for her because she's a woman in this country. She cannot do anything. She feels powerless. And it's like she goes on and on and on about this, but she's directing all of that resentment towards this guy. And I'm like, how is this any of it his fault? Because he's born a guy and he gets to study literature. I think that's the problem with this sort of linear thinking, that especially characters where they are put into this sort of systems where some people are more oppressed than the other, and the first thing they can think about projecting their anger on is to the other lesser oppressed person, just like Effie does with Preston. And she thinks that, oh, he's privileged beyond all because he's a guy and he gets to study literature, and she can't because she's a woman. And then she thinks it's all his fault, which is not. It's the system. She doesn't understand that it's the system that needs dismantling. It's not Preston in of its own. But then she makes him the target of all of her frustrations and anger. I understand that Ava Reid is trying to highlight the misogyny and sexism that the women in her world face, that they're not allowed to study what they want. But it's also strange that it's a selective process, that they can study certain things but not all things, because I would assume if men are looking to oppress women in this society, in the world that she's introducing to us, I don't think they would be selective about that process. Like, it would be a mandatory law to forbid all women from going into tertiary education. There wouldn't even be a selective process. But then I also can see why, she's trying to highlight that Effie is as smart as all these other boys, that she even qualifies to go into the literature college, but because she can't, she has to settle for the architecture college. It is also to highlight that Effie is not like the frivolous other girls who only talk about boys and parties. She's an intelligent person. Like, I can see both sides of the coin for this sort of statement that's being made. And then she also mentions this curious fact that it feels very suspicious for an Argonite to study in a Lyrian university. Effie then gives us more context to her character. She tells us her favorite book by this author Myrodin is a book called Angharad, and the book is about a young girl who becomes the Fairy King's bride, and it's basically her favorite book. She clearly knows that book by heart. Like, she can recite passages in it like nobody's business. Like I said, most of the names in this book are from the Welsh side of the Celtic tradition, and so the name Angharad is a fairly noble name. There's a mythic character called Angharad Golden Hand, and she comes in the story of Peridor, and Peridor is said to be a precursor to one of the knights of the Round Table in King Arthur's company, the Knight Percival, because Peridor is a character who early on is associated with the Grail story, and in the Arthurian legend, Percival was the primary knight who was associated with the Grail story, until in later edition it falls onto the knight Galahad, and Percival sort of becomes a side character to the whole quest, when in actuality he was the primary knight in search for the Holy Grail. And so Peridor, when he first sees Angharad, he falls in love with her, but then he makes a vow to himself that he will not speak to any Christian man until she proclaims her love to him, which seems a bit odd, but and so he becomes known as the mute knight because he doesn't speak. And then one day Angharad witnesses him defeating a knight in, I don't know if it's a tourney or he just defeats him, etc. And she falls in love with him and she proclaims her love to him, and then he finally speaks and reveals himself to be the knight Peridor. Throughout the whole chapter, it is emphasized Effie really wants to study literature, but she's being forced to study in architecture school, which she really hates, and she she's feeling really depressed about it. She's feeling really down, and she sees this one chance to get away from all of this, and the competition feels like a lifeline to her. Just the end of chapter 1, she says she begins to sketch her redesign for the manor. In the beginning of chapter 2, she's already like, I got a letter to say I've been selected by Myrodin's estate. I'm like, what? Did no one else enter that competition? Like, how did she even get that answer so fast? Like I said, the whole business with her architecture school and architecture design is basically one big plot convenience. Like, it is literally the deus ex machina in the whole story. Like, it has no relevance to her as a character or to the plot. We don't even know what she's done that's like incredible that she's got selected. Oh my god. So for those who are not familiar with the term, deus ex machina is a Latin phrase and it translates to God in the machine, and it is a plot device in narration when a character is in an impossible situation or faced with an almost impossible task that you as the reader know that they can't possibly know the answer to, that they can't possibly solve this, but it is miraculously solved by someone or something. So getting back to her story, and because she's selected, she has to go down to Hyred for 6 weeks or something to make a finalized design and then submit it to the Myrodin estate. And so she goes to Master Corbinic to sign off her time away from university, and this will be credited under her studio work. And we're told that Master Corbinic is her advisor, which seems rather strange because Effie is a first year student. I don't understand why a first year student would need an advisor. Like, it would make sense if you were a final year student or even postgraduate or doctorate. Well, then sure, I would understand you would need a supervisor or advisor, but why would a first year need an advisor? What is she being even advised on? I feel like Everett couldn't find any other way for Master Corbinic to be the perpetrator in the situation. She didn't know how else to place Master Corbinic into that situation. She's like, he's an advisor, that's, and we'll move on with them. Like, it doesn't make sense. And why is a first year having an advisor? It doesn't make sense. Also, throughout the video, I'll probably spout like random facts about the names from what I remember. So, the name Corbinic comes from Castle Corbinic, where the Fisher King resides. There's a myth, one of Arthur's knights who goes into Corbinic Castle, he comes across the Holy Grail of the Arthurian legend. So this knight, he comes across the Grail and then he sees there's a salvar and there's also a spear, and this spear is said to be the spear of Longinus, which is described in the Bible if I'm not mistaken. So he grabs the spear, not sure why. He grabs the spear, and when the master of the castle sees that, he chases after the knight to get him to give back the spear. And so what the knight does, he strikes the master of the castle with that spear, and that causes him to become crippled, and that's where he gets that eponymous name of the Fisher King. That hit is called the Dolorous Stroke, and the only one who can relieve him of this burden is the pure knight Galahad. And that's the thing, once the Dolorous Strike is made, everyone in that castle just dies. Castle literally just crumbles, and the land around Corbinic Castle becomes a wasteland. Okay, getting back to this chapter, Effie gets her permission, she leaves university, she takes the train, goes down to Saltney. That's where the manor is, so it's the southern part of the country. So she goes down there, she gets there, she suddenly has a panic attack about being there, and then she calls up her mother to say, I've done this, I'm terrified now, can you come and pick me? And then the mother's like, I cannot believe you would do such a stupid thing, which I quite agree with the mother. I know in this scene we're supposed to empathize with Effie. I can't. I feel like the mother is right. If anything, I sympathize more with the mother than I do with the main character. So Effie's mother refuses to come on her whim, and she's like, you're the one who did this, find a way to get out of it on your own. And then they hang up, and then the driver comes to take Effie up to the manor, but then she is put to stay in this cottage just a bit off from the manor, and the driver says that she's been put there by the mistress of the house. And already I was like, there's the mention of the mysterious mistress of the house. I was like, okay, I'll keep that in mind. And then also on the way to the manor, Effie thinks she sees something out in the woods or something, because this manor is basically right at the edge of a cliff, like quite properly, it's quite far away from houses and shops and stuff, so it's a bit isolated from the rest of the world. And then Effie thinks she sees something crawling between the trees. It sort of gives the gothic vibes and such. Those things are great. I was like, okay, I'm intrigued. What's gonna happen now? And then we get to the next day, and then she meets the guy Preston. She doesn't know he's Preston yet. She just meets the guy and she thinks like he's completely condescending. And then she learns that this is Preston, and then the first thing she does to him is be absolutely rude to him. Like, she just spouts the most stupidest thing out of her mouth, questions his legitimacy to be insult me. She's like, Argentines cannot travel this far into the country. You're only allowed to be in the divided city up in the north, and how could you take out all the books that she wanted? And he's like, first of all, my mother's Lyrian, so I have like their equivalent of like a double passport or something. And he's like, here on the account of the university sent me here. And thirdly, she's like, it's a library, anyone can borrow books, which I'm like, that's true. And that's the thing, she's basically projecting her anger on him on the basis that she feels that she deserves his spot, that he's an Argentine and he's studying Lyrian literature, which feels almost abhorrent to her. She thinks that should be me. I should be the one studying literature. I should be the one writing my thesis on Myrodin. I deserve it more than him on the account that I'm a Lyrian and he's an Argentine. She's basically racist. That's what this is. And she also feels that he shouldn't be allowed to write a paper on their national hero. And I'm like, okay. And the whole thing feels less of a rival and more of a racist. And then we meet Myrodin's son, Ian, though, and he brings Effie to the manor. When Effie sees the poster the first time, she has this whole imagination of this manor being this amazing place, this beautiful manor overlooking the sea. She thinks that this is what his manor is going to look like, and then when she comes there, the illusion is completely destroyed. She sees the place is unrepaired, crumbling, and it's like any moment is like just going to crumble and fall into the sea, and they're all going to die. Like, it's in such a state of disrepair that she doesn't think that there would be any use to even redesign the house. Like, it is literally like on its last foundation. So he's explaining the house that his father built and such. And then Ianto mentions this really curious fact, how the Fairy King is killed by looking into the mirror, which, keep in mind for later on. So the house is basically on the verge of collapse, and Effie finally makes like one proper decision in like the entirety of the book. She's like, I cannot deal with this, I'm gonna leave. And so she tries to go back down to the town, and on her way down, Preston comes in the car and he's like, get in, I'll get you to town. And she puts up a fight about it, but then she eventually gets in, and then they go down to town, and she goes to call her mother to say, I'm leaving, but I don't want to go back to the university, I want to come back home. And her mother's like, my goodness, just leave me be, child, like, you're an adult, learn to be a fucking adult. And I'm like, it's not wrong. But the thing is, Effie had never told her mother what actually happened at the university, like her encounter with Master Corbiny. Like, she's never told anyone, so people think she's just basically acting out. It's a reasonable response to expect from a mother, because her mother doesn't know anything. She just thinks Effie is just having these weird impulses to do such things without thinking them through. And so of course her first instinct is learn to be a fucking adult. You're the one who said you wanted to study in the university, go and finish your degree, don't come back crying here, we cannot deal with you. And so she's like, I cannot go back home and I don't want to go back to the university. And so she has no choice. She's like, I'm forced to be in this town, Saltney and up at High Red Manor. So that's basically why she's sort of stuck there. And then previously, before she goes to make her call with the mother, when she's in the car with Preston, she's trying to open the door and she can't, and he has to lean over to open it for her. And then she mentions his flushed cheeks. It's a funny thing I've noticed, this trend where you clearly have, these characters who are supposed to be enemies or rivals or whatever it is. This main character who clearly has to hate the other person, and yet somehow they just can't help themselves but notice the flush of their cheeks, the way their hair flops perfectly on their hair, the freckles on their nose, the delicate glint in their eyes, their incredible voice. Like, if I was a character and I clearly hated this person, I will not spend my thought thinking about how pretty they are. I'm gonna be like, I hate this person, they're an ugly ogre to me. Anyone who's ever had a resentment towards someone, or or clearly didn't like this person, you would not have the strange thought to say, look how pretty this person is or how wonderful their voice is. Like, you would be irritated by the very sight of the person. It's like, if you're gonna have a character, hate the person, at least hate them properly. Like, the only reason why you would find someone attractive is if you have a crush on them, or you get later learn about their personality and it shines through and you find yourself being smitten by them or find your affections for them, and that's when you start to notice these little things about this person that you find suddenly becomes admirable to you. Not when you hate that person. Like, when you hate that person, you will clearly not notice all of these things, but yet we get this really stupid in my opinion at least. So after her talk with her mother, she goes and meets Preston in the pub, and she's completely condescending towards him. He's doing his work, he's reading one of Myrodin's poems or something, and her first thought is like, he's unworthy to even read anything of Myrodin, let alone write something. She feels he deserves it less on the account that he's Argentine. And then she gets into a squabble with him. He's so privileged that, he probably only took to study literature on a whim because, he doesn't have anything else. He's not passionate about it, unlike me. And I'm like, girl, you're clearly projecting. Like, calm the fuck down. She gets into this entire rant about how, he's completely privileged, that he's a man, he gets to study literature, he gets to do whatever he wants and nobody questions him, and she's a poor little woman, she cannot do anything, she cannot study literature even she wants to. People call her pretty all the time and she doesn't know what to do with those compliments. Like, she goes through this rant like she does throughout the book. Like, truly, she just goes on and on about this. And Preston's like, you don't have to be passionate about something to be devoted to it. And then he clearly gets irritated and he's like, I cannot do any work. He said, I came down here because Ianto is just breathing down my neck and I come here to do work and you are staring me. And he's like, I am just looking for some peace to get on with my thesis, and these people are just getting on my nerves, which I really feel for him. So after her talk with Preston, Effie's like, okay, since I cannot go back to the university or I cannot go back home, I'm stuck here, I will have to make do with what I can. She's like, Preston was right. I don't have to devote myself to architecture to redesign this home. I can be devoted to Myrodin, and that makes all the difference. And so she goes to the manor the next day with a plan. She's like, okay, I can start with the redesigning and stuff. And there's a really funny line. One of her proposed plans is to flip the foyer and the kitchen. So the foyer is facing the west and the kitchen is on the east. So she's like, I want to switch them up so that when you enter the home, you get the sunlight falling from the sunrise. And I'm not sure if it's Ianto or the driver who tells her that if you do that, then the entrance to the home has to face the cliff. It's so stupid. Like, how did Effie not see that? Like, they're right. Like, if you put an entrance out at the cliff, how are people going to get in? And it's like, it's so stupid. And I'm like, more the reason why the whole architecture thing is just a big, huge plot convenience to the entire story. And also, the way Ianto is described gives me a vibe of misogynistic guy, but he's misogynist in this way that he's really nice, but it's an act. And so I keep expecting to happen. He talks sweetly and then suddenly he switches 180 and he starts snarling at her and stuff. We later learn why is that, but I would just rather let him be a bipolar weird guy. It's not that huge of a deal. And he's taking her through the house, and then there's a moment when he tells Effie that, I believe you can really do this, and then he puts his hand on her shoulder as a sort of, a gesture or something, and then she spirals because she's thinking back to what happened to Master Corbinic and stuff, and Ianto sees that, she's clearly distressed, and he leaves, and her first instinct is to tell Preston about it. I'm like, you've just met the guy a couple of days ago, and not only have you been rude to him, but you've been racist and also condescending to him. Why is your first instinct about this situation is to tell him about it? It doesn't make sense at all. What has he done to such a degree to earn your trust that he's the first person you thought of telling? If I was Effie and something like that happened, my first instinct is to just go back to the cottage and just isolate myself for a couple of days before emerging. Because Effie is described like that. She is described as this really anxiety-prone character who keeps giving in to impulses for what she does. So for her to think that to go and tell Preston about this, it does not make sense for her character. Mind you, her interaction with Preston has only passed for 2 days at most. There has never been any other development except for her insulting him, for her to suddenly develop this utmost trust towards him. It's the YA insta-love. That's all I can say. And then there's funny bit where she describes him as not like other guy, because she's referring back to her drive with him, when he brings her down to the town, how when he tries to unlock the door, he's never really touched me, but he's always going around me, and I'm like, that sounds like complete bullshit. Like, that's why I say I cannot believe this book at all, especially being a victim of a sexual assault. The last thing Effie would think is how this person is not even touching her, or he's trying his best to not touch her or be wary of her. Like, regardless of the person's intention, like, the first thing you get into this headspace that clearly all men are like that. And as a person who's been victimized in this way, your first thought is to recoil at any touch regardless. You wouldn't be thinking it in any way. So that's why I'm saying it doesn't even make sense. Like, Ianto touches her and she completely spirals, but somehow Preston is the exception. Like, why? Why the very apparent double standard? Is it because Ianto's a creepy weird dude and Preston's a hot scholar dude who you've clearly been insulting, been racist to, been nothing but rude to him from the moment you've met? So she comes to tell Preston. He's situated in Myrodin's study, so he's doing his work there. So she goes in and he's not there, and she comes across his writing all over the table, and then she finds a piece of paper clearly outlining his thesis title, and I'm like, are you for real? And that's really when we and Effie learn what he's really there trying to do. So his whole thesis is based on how Myrodin could not have written most of his work, or there's someone else who has co-authored that work. He's not the sole author. So that's really what his thesis is. And she finds that's another big plot convenience, because Preston tells us, for when he's in the pub with Effie, that Ianto is always breathing down his neck. He's always just skulking around, always keeping an eye on him. Like, I would assume that if he's written anything, he would at least write it in his own language, or if he's written anything that's like the common language that anyone can read, he would at least have the proper cautions to keep it hidden, regardless if he's in the room or not. And yet Effie just effortlessly finds his thesis proposal and she confronts him about it, and this is where I have like the biggest bone to pick with this part. So she makes a great fuss about it and basically blames everything under the sun at Preston. For some strange reason, he's like, then help me find evidence to disprove him. And it's like, what? Then he reveals his plan that if she helps him to get the evidence he needs to publish his thesis, he will make sure she gets into the literature college as well. And then Effie brings up a good point that won't people discredit him of the thesis on the account of his nationality, that it's going to be some sort of Argentine propaganda. And then he says, that's why her name is going to be in it. And he says that, let's consider it as an armistice. If I were Effie, my first thought is, this person is clearly using me, because I do not see any way this is going to benefit me. And then he further tries to persuade her by saying that he will put down her name as a co-author of this thesis, which, mind you, is being sanctioned by the university. Effie at first she denies him and says that the university is not going to accept a woman into the literature course, or let alone co-author a thesis. And he's like, oh no, the university's traditions are so backward and archaic, they should be changed and stuff. And it's like, okay. It's a very funny line, but also he proclaims himself to not be a misogynist, which is, a win for Effie, I guess. Also, why is Preston trying so hard to defend this girl who he's just met a couple of days ago, who's been nothing but racist to him, has done nothing but insulted him at every chance this go, but yet he's here like, I'll help you get into the university that you really want to. Like, I can understand if he's doing it as a ploy to manipulate her, like, because she has that evidence to go to Ianto, and he's like, I have to think fast, and so he plays into her emotions. He's like, okay, help me do this and I will help you get into the university college. We can understand his motive then, that he's making her a willing player into the situation to not get himself exposed, which is considerably understandable. And then, as we progress into the story, he realizes that, it's not what he's actually intended to do, and maybe we can sort of develop into a love story later on, but at least his motive here is understandable. He's doing it to stop her from going to Ianto with his thesis title. But that's not the case. He's just like, I will help you get into the university because of insta love, I guess. Something I can't can't understand, like, he's immediately drawn to her like every other guy, but he is not like any other guy. Avery makes sure to emphasize constantly that he is not sexist, he's not a misogynist, he's incredibly thoughtful and careful of Effie. He's not like other boys. He is specifically tailor-made for Effie. But that's the thing, I don't understand what is it that makes him drawn to her like completely immediately. Like, we do get this indication from mostly men. She's constantly being said that, you know, she's very pretty, she's very beautiful. And so is that why Preston is immediately drawn to her? That because she's this beautiful person, regardless if she's being racist to him? That's why I don't know how we're supposed to take that context, because is it supposed to highlight her attribute, her physical appearance as a character, or is it talking under the context of these characters being sexist and misogynistic towards her? Like, which is it? After hearing everything that Preston has to say to her, you would think Effie would at least use a bit of her common sense to think this through. Like, this is a boy you've just met a couple of days, you don't know anything about him, you've insulted him, you've been a racist to him, you clearly hate him because somehow he's responsible for taking out books on your favorite author from the library, even though the library is a common use for all university students. And then you find him writing this thesis trying to discredit your favorite author, and you confront him about it, and the moment he promises a place in the university college, she's immediately like, I will help you. Like, you would think she would at least articulate what is happening a bit more, try to come to a proper conclusion, a proper decision, but she's just like, sure, I'll help you. There's nothing to say that she even considered her principle of her own feelings towards this author and his body of work and her favorite book that she says is basically a lifeline when she was in a really dark place. You would think, as someone who clearly idolized this author, she would put up more of a fight, or even try and stop Preston from doing his thesis. Like, if I was Effie and I had this favorite author who I am obsessed with, and I see someone trying to discredit them, I would do everything in my power to sabotage whatever they're trying to do to discredit my favorite author. And if push comes to shove, I will do what is necessary to stop them. But Effie's all like, sure, let's find the evidence to discredit my favorite author. How does that even make sense? And okay, let's say, for argument's sake, that they do find evidence discrediting Myrodin for his authorship. How is Effie certain that when they submit this thesis, the university is even going to allow her to be a student in it? Like, just because Preston promises that he will make her a co-author and fight for her place, why he would do that in such a short amount of time that he's known her is beyond me to understand. But somehow Effie just believes him. On what account basis? Like, Preston is not the university. He's not the dean or the chancellor or anyone high up in the university. He's just a student. And worst of all, he's an Arkansas student in a Lyrian university. Like, what is this word going to hold power for? You know, it doesn't make sense. And then also, what would be the point then of her studying literature, even if they did allow her to study into the literature college? Because her whole personality at this point is being a Myrodin girly. She's completely obsessed with his work, and that's the only reason why she wants to study literature. And if she helps him find the evidence to discredit her author, and somehow it comes to light and everybody sort of, you know, ban his book, they blacklist him, whatever it is, what is she then going to study at the literature school? We're not even told that she likes any other author or she admires any other author. She's just obsessed with this one guy. And then what else are they going to study at this literature college? What is Effie going to study in this literature college if it's not Myrodin? And also, how is she certain is the university going to allow her to study literature if she presents this thesis as a co-author to Preston? If anything, when the university sees her name with Preston's in the thesis title, they're going to bloody expel her. Like, how is she certain that just because Preston promised a co-authorship of this thesis, the university is even going to accept it in the first place? They can be rejected even if it's being headed by the head of the literature school. Like, this is a line that she says, you know, how is scholarship not political? I mean, you can clearly see it can be seen as a political ploy, you know. And like, what has Preston given her, like, or told her to assure her that she will get a place in the literature school? You see what I mean? That nothing in the story makes sense. Like, the motives don't make sense, the characters don't make sense. Everything is just one big plot convenience for us to just get to the meat of the story, which is basically the insta-love between Effie and Preston. Alright, so then we move to the two of them debating about Myrodin and his work. Effie, instead of proving points to counter Preston's argument, goes back to insulting him on his nationality and such. Like, I don't even see them as rivals at this point. She's just being racist. Like, anytime he brings up an argument and she cannot think of anything to counter it, the first thing she attacks is his nationality on his account of being an Argentine. And I'm like, and then Preston gets her to ask Ianto for the blueprint of the house because he's convinced that there has to be something incriminating Myrodin for the fraud that he is. You know, he's just somehow convinced that there is a secret in the house, even though he's looked around Myrodin's study, he's looked around everywhere he could in the house, and there's nowhere else he could look for, but he's just somehow convinced that there is a secret place in that house that's hiding incriminating evidence. So Effie goes to Ianto and asks for the blueprint, but then he brings her down to the pub and then he comments on her look, and then Effie asks for the blueprint and he just takes it out of his, which I find really funny, because if anyone's seen architecture blueprint, you cannot fold that thing into your pocket. The whole thing is the size of an A1 or even bigger. It's like a whole roll of paper. You can't just fold it and slipping into your pocket. It's not a small thing. But I digress. And then while they're talking, he seems to be suffering from personality disorder or bipolar or something. 1 minute he's noise, next minute he's just snarling at her, being an absolute ass. And then Effie just conveniently mentions that she forgot to take her pill that morning, which I find really strange. And this is also another ongoing bit in the story where, other than the man in the story telling Effie that she's pretty like all the time, because that's the only way they express misogyny, is that if convenient, Effie will have forgotten to take her pill. If not convenient, she would have taken an extra dosage. Like, inconsistency in this story is so staggering. Like, if this is someone who's been on her medication since she was 8 years old, you would think that for 8 years when she's been taking this, she would not have forgotten a day of not taking it. And then she casually says that, you know, sometimes she takes an extra one. Like, that's not how medicine works. You take it in specific dosage for specific ailment. You know, you cannot just simply take as much as you want when you want and then just conveniently forgot to take it when the plot needs you to forget to take. I don't even know what to say about this. So Ianto has clearly switched personality at this point, and he grabs her to get her back to Hired Manor, and while in the car he sort of lunges at her, and Effie for a moment thinks she sees the Fairy King and she throws herself off the car and she doesn't die, which I find completely ridiculous. All she sustains is a little scraps on her elbows and knees, and like she was clearly describing as they were going really fast, like he was clearly rushing to get back to the manor, and this house is on top of a cliff. They are quite properly moving uphill very fast, and for her to throw herself off the car, I don't know how she's still alive. Like, how did she not sustain any broken bones at this point? How is she even alive and not have fallen off the bloody cliff? It's a mystery. The plot needs Effie to be alive, so she's alive. And so then she picks herself up from the road and she trudges back up to the guest house, and Preston is just there waiting for her, and you just know there's like a tender cleaning moment scene waiting to happen. And he does, you know, he brings her in, he cleans her wounds and such, and like, okay. Then they go over the blueprint, and then Effie mentions the basement again, which, you know, the basement has come up a couple of times, so you know that's going to be like part of the climax. And then Effie suddenly brings up about Mrs. Myrodin, the mysterious mistress of the house, who they've still not seen at this point, but you somehow know that she's going to be important, or at least I knew she's going to be important, because if something is mentioned like a few times by different characters, you know they're going to be important later, and then you have mentions of one person, but we never see them throughout the entire book. You know the author is just waiting to reveal them at the end, at the most climactic moment. So one is the basement, another one is this mysterious mistress of the house, and Preston says he doesn't know who she is, and he's like, she's not that important important, and somehow Effie gets all fussed up about it. She's like, why are you dismissing her and stuff? And I'm like, why are you so intrigued of her? You've never met her. You think that she doesn't like you, that's why she's put you to stay this guest house and not in the manor itself. I mean, they argue a bit about it, but then they move on and look over the blueprints again, and then they find a small space in Ianto's room, like it's right behind the bookshelf or something, and they think that something might be hidden in there, and so they decide to go check it out next day when Ianto has gone down to church for the morning. So come next day, they sneak into Ianto's room, and on the way that they're already like flirting with each other, and so they're looking around the room. At first they can't seem to find that space that's mentioned in the blueprint, but then they see that it's maybe the bookshelf is blocking it, and somehow two scrawny people manage to push it away, and they find that space behind, and surprise surprise, they do find something in there. It's a tin box, and when they pry it open, they find a diary in it, and some of the photographs slips out from it, and it's of a young girl on the cusp of adulthood, I guess. It's not specifically said how old she is, just that she's young. And the way the photographs have taken is a sort of, this woman is in a nightgown, and so she's posing in this very, I won't say seductive, but the way the photograph is taken is meant to show her as this very enchanting, sexy person. And the third photograph is her completely naked on the bed, and the moment Effie sees this photo, she immediately thinks that this person has to be a victim. This person, someone took these photos of her, and it's found inside Myrodin's diary. He must have done something to her. She immediately jumps to all these conclusions just by looking at the picture, which there's no context for it at this point. Like, they don't know who this girl is, why this photograph's in his diary or anything. And the way Effie sort of talks through it, right, she feels empathetic towards the girl in the photo, because she says, oh, they look the same, she has the pale hair as me, she's as young as me, and she's in this very vulnerable position, she's been photographed like this, clearly Myrodin has done something to her. I'm just there like, how did she even jump to this conclusion? It's not even said who this girl is. It doesn't say under what context is this photograph even taken. Yes, it's found inside Myrodin's diary, but that doesn't clearly mean that he's taken them or had someone not slipped them inside his diary and hidden it there. We don't know, and yet Effie jumps to all these conclusions just from glancing at the photo. And then they read the diary, and there's a point Myrodin writes about meeting Blackmar's daughter, and he makes a comment that her mind is frivolous, and Effie immediately sort of takes up arms about it. She's like, how could he think such a thing? How could he have written Angharad and written such a thing about a woman? Angharad is not like any other girl. He's written her to be this cunning, seductive girl, but she's also naive and vulnerable. Like, how could he think such a thing? And I'm like, Effie has not learned to separate the author from the art. She just thinks that whatever she reads is synonymous to the person that she will meet. Like, she thinks they are basically interchangeable in a way, like they cannot be separated. And so for her to find Myrodin's diary and then read about what he's written, and suddenly like she cannot contrive the two realities together. She cannot convince herself that someone who had written the book Angharad can also write something like this about a woman. And I'm like, Effie, that's not how basic personality of people work. Like, one woman can be daring and cunning and such, and another person can just be passive and submissive, and the next person can just be derivative, and the next person can be submissive and seductive. That's human personality. We're all not the same, but Effie cannot contextualize what she is comparing all of reality to this fictional character, and so she is having difficulties in critical thinking. And so she's really bothered about it. She's really bothered about how Myrodin could have written such a thing. And just as they are trying to read more of the diary, Ianto comes up and he discovers them, and Preston quickly hides the diary behind him, and Ianto thinks that they're both like cozying up to each other and such, and he doesn't like it. And there's a point in the book where Effie has been working late one night, and when she's on her way to the guest house, she comes across this person in a white dress just floating about the house, and she thinks it's a ghost, but we know it's probably the mysterious mistress that's been mentioned a couple of times now, because obviously it's her. Who else is in that house, but Effie doesn't think so, because Effie doesn't use her critical thinking skills, so she thinks it's a ghost, and she tries to look for the ghost the first time, but she gets scared and she runs away. And then this night she tries to look for the ghost again, But then she comes across Ianto in his room, sort of speaking to himself like he's Professor Quirrell. So you already know something strange is happening, but Effie doesn't know what it is, and we don't know what it is either, so we carry on. And now that they have Myriden's diary, they start reading it and see what actually took place. And so there's this one name that keeps coming up a lot in the story, is this person called Blackmaw. And so they're like, who is Blackmaw? And he is an old friend of Myriden, and they're like, we can go and see him and see if there's any clue that we can get. And so they write him a letter and he responds. Actually, Preston writes him a letter which is too formal and he rejects, and then Effie writes like a very charming letter and he accepts their invitation. He invites them to Blackmaw Mansion, and that's when we learn about Effie's real name. So Effie's short for Euphemia, and it said that she's named after Saint Euphemie. And so there is this folklore about naming children after saints. So it said that in this world, it is said that if a child is named after saint, it is said to be because they are a changeling. So for context, a changeling child is part of the Celtic myth about how the Faes have their own sickly child, and they would sometimes come into the human realm and switch their child with a healthy human child. So the changeling child would grow up in the human household. They are constantly described as being different, as being constantly sick, as just a very strange child. They're not normal, and sometimes even intellectually challenged. And the reason I say this folklore in particular has real life connotation is because people back then, they did not understand when their child is different from every other normal child. I mean, now we understand it to be that they are on the spectrum of autism, or they are intellectually challenged, or some children are born with Down syndrome. Like this, there's so many factors that can be contrived to contribute to a child not being born normal. But then people back then, they did not have that sort of knowledge. So when their child behaved differently or strangely than other normal child, they think their own child has been swapped by a Fae child. So the child that they have with them is the changeling child. And in some cases, some of the parents, they actually kill that child because of the idea that that's not their real child. So, but in the context of a study in drowning this story, we are told that only changeling childs are named after saints because it helps to drive away the evils and such, because those childs are said to be just born wrong or born unruly, temperamental, like they're not normals. And if that didn't work, they say that the mother have the right to just abandon the child for the fate to take. And this is what happened to Effie. So she says that when she's born, she was a very difficult child and her mother didn't like her at all, neither did her grandparents, and so they named her after Saint Euphemie, patron saint of storytelling or something. And when she continued to behave as such, her mother left her one night on the riverbank, and that's where she met the Fairy King, and he'd come to take her. And she says that although she saw that he's the Fairy King, she was not afraid. She actually wanted to go with him, but right as she is about to take his hand, and that's when her mother comes back and snatches her away from the Fairy King. And so all that the Fairy King was able to take of her is her ring finger of her left hand, and this is to say that she will always belong to the Fairy King and that no man can ever claim her, so that it's a reminder to her and everyone that she belongs to the Fairy King. Also, another thing I've noticed in the story is that Eva names all the saints in the story after characters from Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen, because I recognize their name: Marinel, Amret, Acrasia, Duessa, Belphoebe, Artigal. Euphemia is, I think, she's not in the Fairy Queen. She's not a character in the Fairy Queen. So I distinctively remember it's a Greek name. I don't know exactly which Greek deity she is. I find this whole thing really strange because she has created this world, or specifically Lyrians, to have Welsh names. Corbinic, Myriden, Angharet, Ianto, Lyrian, they're all Welsh names. But then she has saints named after characters from the Fairy Queen, written by Edmund Spenser, an English poet who wrote the whole thing during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. And I'm like, something is not making sense here, because you would think that if you had created this country of people as after Welsh names, you would think that she would also go on to make other characters in them named after the Celtic myth and not something an English poet wrote. Like, does she think that Welsh people and the English people are the same thing? Does she not know that the Irish, the Welsh, the Scottish people, does she not know they collectively hate the English people? Like, they were conquered by the English too. It's not just the United Kingdom as a whole colonized the world. Like, okay, we'll not get into that debate, but I just wanted to point this out, which feels very lackluster on her part. Like, would it not make sense to have their saints named after Celtic mythical characters? Or maybe she's just taking it a token fantasy name because, of course, Welsh names already sound quite fantasy-like and mythical in their own sense. So they're like, oh, I can use this. Nobody's going to know the difference. So that is, I digress. We'll get back to Preston and Effie. So Effie is telling this story to him about the Fairy King and he doesn't seem to buy it, which is reasonable on his part. And I quite liked the way Effie talks about her relationship with her mother, because it's a very complicated relationship, because she admits that her mother did leave her out there at the riverbank for her to just be taken away, and yet she did come back for her. So that has to be a part of her that still loved her, didn't it? And so she also, she defends her mother. She says, she did come back for me. She didn't just leave me there to die. She then took me to the doctor to help me with this delusions that I'm having and such. And and she made sure I had taken my medication all the time. Even if she doesn't like me most of the time, she's still my mother. And I was also a difficult child. It must be hard for her. And I quite like this complicated relationship. It's not just really black and white. And I wish that we had explored more of this. But this is the only mention we get of her, because first and foremost, this is supposed to be a love story and nothing else really matters. But it's the following day and Effie and Preston, they're like, okay, Blackmar's invited to his home, we're gonna go. So the first working theory is that Blackmar is the one who wrote Angharad, because they find one of the entries in Myridian's diary stating how Blackmar came to give Angharad to him, and she's referred to as she and her. They don't know why the book is being referred to like that. And at this point, I had already known that Angharad is a person, and I had already had an inkling that this is probably the mysterious mistress. Like, I just knew that the Angharad that they are referring to is the mistress of the house, which we still haven't seen. It's just there being mysterious, but that's one of their working theories. They go and tell Ianto an excuse. They're like, Effie needs some book from the library and the closest one is in this town and we have to go there, and Preston is driving me down there. We're gonna take a couple of days and then we'll be back. Ianto doesn't like it, but he's like, he cannot stop them. And so on their drive to Blackmar's mansion, there's more flirting going on, because what else are they gonna do other than flirt? Then they reach his mansion and it's filthy rich, and they go in and they question him about Myridian and how he came to write about Angharad. But Blackmar seems, he seems very cagey about it. Like, he doesn't want to talk about it, and he says, I cannot answer all your questions, but you can ask the editor tomorrow at the ball or something. And you just know, like, that whole scene is written just so Effie could get dressed up and look very pretty indeed. And when Preston sees her, he's like, oh my god, she's so beautiful. She's beautiful already in everyday life, but now she's more extra beautiful. You just know the scene is waiting to happen. And it's just something that I thought about. It's just very funny. So they get to spend the night in Blackmar's mansion, and convenient, Effie forgets to bring her pills. Like, of course she does. And then she's like, I cannot sleep without my sleeping pill, and the only thing that can help me sleep if I'm not alone. And so they both sleep on the same bed, but no touching. We maintain the halal distance. But there's also more flirting, so there's that. And then come next morning, while Preston is showering, she just snoops around the room for some strange reason, and just so conveniently she looks under the bed of this room in this huge mansion they're staying, and she just conveniently finds a few letters under the bed. My goodness, like, at least have a bit of, I don't know, like I said, this whole book is just one big plot convenience to move the character forward, because they hardly have to do anything. Everything just basically falls into their lap. They are in a mansion. This guy is Blackmore is filthy rich. He lives in a mansion, and you would know that when there's a mansion, that would be guest house or guest rooms for people who are not part of the family to be in. And it's like, regardless if the room that they're staying in had been previously occupied by a family member or not, that room is out of bounds for people not part of the family. Usually guests are put in the guest room for them to sleep, and yet somehow Effie and Preston just conveniently find themselves in this room that happened to be lived in by an old family member that has since disappeared. So they just happen to be staying there, and Effie just happens to find these letters under the bed, and I'm like, can you get any more convenient? Like, it's just, my goodness. So they read the letter, and Preston immediately jumps to the conclusion that Myrodin had been having an affair with Blackmar's daughter, and the room they're staying in used to be lived in by that daughter. And Effie somehow makes a whole fuss of it. She was always making fuss of things without using her critical thinking. Like, ever since she's read what Myrodin has written in his diary, she's been having this conflicted feeling about the author, because, she's always attributed the author to be synonymous to the book that she's read. She thinks both are completely the same thing, and then she learns that he's actually a person and not her idea of him. She's having trouble trying to accept it, which in my opinion feels like a good narrative to build on. And yet the problem is not that Effie's learning to differentiate fiction from reality. The thing that she's most hung up about is Myrodin somehow taking this girl's virginity. Like, maybe he somehow forced himself onto her. She's probably a victim in all of this. That's what she keeps being hung up about. She's very up in arms about this girl who probably has no agency, and she's probably just forced to do all that she's been asked to do because of all these men. And know that at this point we still don't get any context to what really happened. We don't know what actually happened between Blackmar's daughter and Myrodin. We don't know if the relationship was consensual or what actually took place, because all we have are these very vague diary entries and this pieces of scattered letters. Like, we don't really know what happened. It's all coming from different perspectives. We still don't know the whole story of what really happened, and Effie is just making up this whole narrative in her mind about it. But then there's a letter that Myrodin had written that gives us a clue that Blackmar's daughter had been sort of pursuing him as well, because she is the one who's written to him about something, and she's also attached a poem of hers for him to look over. And that's the letter that he's responded to, saying how he's surprised she managed to find him this far and to have sent her work as well. And so somehow, because of this letter, we get a clue that, maybe this was a consensual relationship, that it wasn't played as he was pursuing this young girl, that maybe she had been somehow in love with this guy as well. And yet Effie gets a fantasy in a twist, thinking, oh, this girl is definitely a victim. Like, she is so narrow-minded in her perspective that she sees this girl as nothing but a victim in all of this. How are we to even trust Effie's words? Like, one moment she's like, I'm seeing delusions, I'm seeing things out of the woods, I'm seeing that and this, I am forgetting to take my pills, I'm taking more than the expected dosage. Like, anything that comes out of Effie's mouth or Effie's thought, we have to take with a handful of salt. It's not just a pinch of salt, it's like a handful. Oh my god. And then the party happens at night, and they're all dressed up, and Blackmar then brings them to talk to the editor who published Myrodin's book Angharet. The editor's name is called Marlowe. This guy is Marlowe Jr. It was Marlowe Sr. who's actually worked with Myrodin to publish Angharet. But Marlowe Jr. doesn't really have much clue to what really happened back then or something. And then, they're trying to ask him questions, and he's really not interested, and he's getting up to leave, and if he tries to use her little charm, and then it basically backfires, and he's like, have a dance with me and I'll tell you anything you need. She's trapped in this, and then Preston just comes to her rescue and takes her to the dance floor, and they dance. Like, you just know a scene like this was just waiting to happen. Like, none of this is subtle at all. Like, it's so set up for us to have this scene, the dressing room scene, the sleeping on the one bed scene, this dancing scene. Like, it's so contrived and so set up that you just cannot believe that any of this happened naturally. And then during the dance, Effie realizes, oh yes, she's in love with Preston. And no, at this point, they've only only known each other at most is a week. Only a week, and so much has developed between them that they're now like almost in love. Then they leave the party because they had promised Ian told that they're coming back like the next day, so like they have to make it back to Highroad Manor before midnight. And so while they're in the car, Effie's crying. She's feeling overwhelmed in all of this, and then Preston is trying to console her, and she's like, why are you being so nice to me? And he's like, he goes into great details about a lot of things that we don't see. Like he somehow manages to notice in this very brief week that he's known her, but he's gone into this great detail as if he's known her whole life, and it's as if it's something that she herself has never realized about herself before. And to quote a famous boy band, you don't know you're beautiful, and that's what makes you beautiful. For a book that is priding itself on being a feminist, it really does take a man in the story to tell our main character what she really is. So they get back to Highroad, and Ian is being a complete asshole because he thinks the two of them are like really cozying up together, and Effie sort of goes into a spiral. Like he's being really rude to her, he's snarling, he's like, I want that redesign of a blueprint immediately, and she hasn't done anything, and he's getting really mad. Like I would understand his feelings too. Like if I invited this person to my home to help me redesign my house, but yet here she is playing the flirting game with this other guy who's just skulking about my home, like I would get mad too, And she comes out of the room, and Preston meets her outside, and he's trying to console her, and she somehow immediately jumps to the conclusion that they have to go down to the basement. Like there's no prior inclination or prior conversation that lead into this. She just suddenly says that they have to go into the basement. It's the only place they haven't looked yet. There's something in there they have to look, which doesn't make sense because Preston says that he's been around the home, but one, he's never met the mistress, so he doesn't know where she is. She's just there in the house, somehow mysterious, and he's never given any context that he's actually explored the whole home. He just says he's given the material and he just can't seem to find anything. And then they discover the hidden room from the blueprint. Now they're like going into the basement without exploring any part of us. She's like, we have to go to the basement, there's something in there, and we're like, how do we even know there's anything in there? It's like, it doesn't make sense. And then it's very funny that Effie suddenly mentions about flashlight, because up at this point this whole story is taking place somewhere in the mid-century, so there are cars and trains, but I believe it's more of like industrial revolution, steam train, the steam car, that sort of mid-century is what I'm thinking about. And suddenly there's like flashlights. I'm like, what? Because the characters clearly use like candles and kerosene lamps to light up their home at night, and suddenly there's flashlights. I'm like, that doesn't make sense. And then they sort of argue about it for a bit, and Effie tells him no, she has to do this, and Preston's like, no, you don't have to, there's more to you. And then he goes on to this great revelation to explain to her all the things that she has not clearly realized about herself. And then Preston reveals that he does know what Master Corbinic has done to her. And how does he know this? We are never told. Okay, he says that he knows what had happened to her. How does he know what had happened to her? Because this is something that had only transpired between Effie and Master Corbinic. We don't know how the rumors started, but the entirety of the university, the rumors that have been spreading around is that Effie is the one who came on to Master Corbinic. She's the one who slept with him to get through her grades or whatever is it, The consensus of the rumor is that she is not a victim in this. She is probably the perpetrator. If I was Preston and I was in this university and I'm hearing all these rumors without being a first-hand witness to what actually happened, I would have a more inclination to believe the rumors, or at least believe this is what is being said, without actually knowing what has transpired between the people of the rumors. And yet somehow he just knows that it's Master Corbinic that has done something to Effie without Effie ever telling him what it is. It doesn't make sense. And I feel like Eva Reid had written this just to show how Preston is not like the other boys. If Effie is not like the other girls, Preston is definitely not like the other boys. He doesn't listen to rumors. He just knows the complete objective truth without anyone telling him about it. And he is able to tell Effie everything that no man has ever been able to tell her. Things that she herself hadn't realized before about herself. This is they're perfect for each other, really. And so at this point, Effie has realized she's in love with Preston and she really wants to get it on with him, and yet he doesn't want to. He seems to keep her at a distance, and she is really chuffed about this, and so she questions him like, why won't he touch her? And he makes this incredibly cliche quote about how he won't be one of the men who uses her. I'm like, first of all, how are you certain that men have used Effie before? He's only known about Master Corbinic, and other than that, he's just heard rumors, and even then, he's not witness to what had transpired between Master Corbinic and Effie. And who are these other men that he's speaking of, that he somehow has knowledge that has used Effie that we don't? Oh my god, I just cannot with this book. Not only is the plot convenience gets on my nerve, it's this nonsense as well. Truly does. So Effie is determined to do something about getting the key to the basement, and so when Iento first brings her around the manor to look around, he shows her that basement, and then the key to the basement is hanging around his neck for some strange reason. We don't know why. Then she is trying to find a way to get that key, and while on her way to Pirate Manor the next day, she sees Iento stalking down the trees because there's a mention of a storm that is coming along in a couple of days, and it's supposed to be this really horrible storm that it seemed to be in danger of like really drowning the whole of Saltney and even maybe destroy Pirate Manor. And so he's stalking down the trees to make sure that, you know, they're not uprooted and such. And he asks Effie to help get his jacket, and she goes in and she meets the driver Weatherall, and he's about to fuck off because he's like, I'm not staying in this place when the storm hits, and he's just like, he's fucked off. And Effie's like, okay, she doesn't know what to do. She takes Iento's jacket and he goes to put it on him, and somehow in that short walk from grabbing the jacket and going to Iento, she contrives this plan to get that key. It just happens because of plot convenience. So she takes the jacket, she goes to Iento, and he says, put it on my shoulder because he's taking the tree. And so she puts it on his shoulder, and while she's doing that, she just manages to untie the cord of the chain. I'm not sure how it's described, but this key is hanging in a cord that's around his neck, so I would assume it's sort of tied in a knot. But Effie somehow just manages to undo that while pushing the jacket on him, and she manages to grab the key and slip it up her sleeve. Seriously, this is some James Bond level kind of spy dexterity. For a person who's never shown much talent or much ability to do even the simplest task, Effie seems to possess, great spy skills. And he doesn't notice it. If someone wore something as heavy as a key on their chest for a long time, when that mass is removed, you would know the difference. But somehow Effie manages to do this, and Iento doesn't notice, and she's like, I've done it. It truly is plot convenience of the century. You cannot get any more convenience than this. So she goes back to see Preston, and she's like, I've got the key. So they go down to the basement, and Effie dives under the water, and somehow she manages to find something under that, and it's a black box, and it had the name Angharit written on it, and we're like, ooh, mysterious box with the name Angharit written on it. So they take it back to the guest house. I don't know how Iento doesn't notice them just hurrying back to the guest house with a black box in their arms. I don't think they even took that long swimming under there. I think at least maybe 15 to 20 minutes at best, but yet, and the moment they come out, they don't run into Iento and he doesn't see them, and they get back to the guest house, and then Preston gets her to change out of her wet clothes into warm ones, and she does, and she gets into bed, and he's getting up to leave. He doesn't want to get stuck in the storm, and she's like, I kid you not, this is an actual quote from the book. She pleads him to stay because, I quote, you can't leave. If you leave, I'll die, end quote. She literally says this. She literally says that she will die if he leaves, and I'm like, it's so corny. She is the one who insisted that they go to the basement. She is the one who volunteered to dive underwater to get that black box, to find what is hidden in there. She is the one who's done all this thing, and now she's like, I'm afraid I'm going to die. It doesn't make sense. And for a feminist novel, this character really seems to embody the spirit of codependence on her male counterpart. And so, he stays, and then they kiss, and then they get on with it, congratulations, I guess. And she's not a virgin anymore. Yay. Just before we get to the climax and the denouement of the story, there's also a part before they do it where Effie tells Preston that, she's never done it before. Like, whatever happened between her and Master Communic, they've done other stuff, but, whatever that is, but they've never actually done it. And then Preston says that, it won't be like that. I will be kind to you, which I felt really weird about. Like, what does it mean he'll be kind to her? It's like, and what does he mean that it won't be like that? Has he experienced sexual abuse before, or has he done sexual abuse to someone else to tell Effie that it won't be like that? Like what is the context? Does he mean that it won't be like that? How does he know what is it even like? Like, it's such a weird passage to read. I don't know. So they do it, and then they have some pillow talk, mostly like it's really boring stuff, and then they fall asleep, and Effie gets up, and then she wakes Preston up, and they see the storm has come, and they're like, we're fucked. Maybe they should have thought of getting to safety first, because the storm has been like, they literally said the storm is like a day or two away from arriving, and instead of like, we should collect all that we need to collect and get to safety, they're mostly just thinking with their what, and we can't do anything about that. So they're somehow trapped in that place for now. And so Effie and Preston have realized the storm is raging, and so they're like, we have to get out of here before the place gets flooded, and before they get trapped. They're like, we need to go. And then they remember that all the evidence that they've collected, the letters, the diary, the photographs, everything that they've collected is still in that bloody manor. And like, we have to get it. So they brave through the storm and get into the manor, and they go into the study, and surprise, surprise, who's there? Ianto. He's found Preston's thesis title still fucking lying around the table. Like, I don't know why he didn't just get rid of it or just burn it or done whatever. It's still fucking lying in that study. And so once Preston and Effie, leave Blackmar's mansion and the party, and they're heading back, Blackmar actually calls Ianto to say, there's these 2 university students. They've been here asking about Myrodin and asking about all of this. And then Ianto's like, funny, I'm also hosting the 2 university students. Yeah, and then he puts it together that it's these 2 idiots that's gone there. And so he comes into the study where they have just conveniently just left everything lying down, the diary, the photograph, everything they've collected. It's just fucking just lying around in the study for Ianto to have a look. And he sees the title of the thesis, the one that Preston has written, and he's rightfully pissed off. He's like, how dare you do this? Like, how dare you try and destroy my father's name, my father's legacy? Like, I mean, he's rightfully correct. And Effie tries to, salvage the situation. She's like, okay, you can have all of these things, but they need to leave now, because if they don't, they're going to quite possibly drown in the storm, because it's going to destroy the manor, and they will not be able to get out. And but Ianto's like, nobody's leaving this manor. And he says that there's a folklore in the story. It's something that Ianto had mentioned to Effie previously, stating that if a fatherless child is sacrificed upon a foundation of the building, it will hold through centuries, so that nothing will be able to destroy it. And he says, well, I happen to have 2 fatherless child in my position, but I only need to kill one of them. So he manages to capture Preston, ties him up with chain, and throws him down into the basement. Effie's just screaming, crying, throwing up, trying to save Preston because she's a weak little girl, she cannot do anything. Ianto grabs her, brings her up to his bedroom, and he's like, finish that blueprint for me. The moment that guy dies and Hyrule Manor stands, I want to redesign it. And obviously Effie doesn't want to do it. The love of her life is probably drowning in the basement. I need to save him. But then Ianto sort of forcefully kisses her, and what she does is that there's earlier in the book, her first car ride with Preston, when she had gone down, she meets some weird local. He's like, what is a pretty girl like you doing up in that creepy old manor and stuff? And she's like, here to redesign the manor and stuff. And he says, be careful, there's a lot of weird things going around. And he gives her this couple of hagstones. We're told that the hagstones will be able to look through some of the illusions that's casted by the fair folk. And so when Ianto forcefully kisses her, she just happens to have the hagstones in her pocket, and she takes them and just shoves them down his mouth, and he staggers back, and she gets this window of opportunity. What she does is she takes the hagstone and she looks at Ianto for the first time, and surprise, surprise, he's the Fairy King. Why this sudden strange out of left field plot twist? we don't know. So the Fairy King then tells her that, he's been looking for her for 12 years. Her mother left her out for him, so she is owed to him. Regardless if her mother did come back, what is owed to him cannot be taken back. And so he's been looking for Effie for 12 years, but then she's somehow been protected by her mortal tricks. What this trick is, we don't know. I mean, Effie is just, every other page in the story, she's just either thinking about how she's a woman and a victim in all of the situation, or otherwise she's just throwing herself impulse after impulse of bad decisions. And I don't know what sort of mortal tricks he is referring to here, but I mean, she's already mad half the time. I don't know how else she has the capacity to protect herself in addition to that. And so the Fairy King then tries to trick her into going with him. Effie's like, I'll go with you if you save Preston. And I don't know why the Fairy King just doesn't take her away. He's like, instead of taking you forcefully, I would rather have you follow me willingly, because that's basically the climactic moment. Things are about to get down. And then she says, how do you want me? Do you want me on my knees? And then he's like, yes, very much, yes sir. And so she goes down on her knees, but we know this is not Effie surrendering in submission. This is Effie coming into her power. This is Effie having a plan up her sleeve, like something she has not displayed throughout the entire book, except now that she's faced with this Fairy King. I don't know how she's just not running out for her life, but somehow she's going to defeat the Fairy King. This is feminism, so she gets down on her knees, she grabs a big chunk of a glass that's down there. I don't know how that glass came to be. It might be from the shattered window, but I don't know how a window glass is reflective just as a mirror glass, but we're not getting into semantics here. So she goes down on her knees, she grabs a piece of glass, and she makes the Fairy King look at his own reflection, and he dies. Yay, he's killed incredibly easily. And then she goes down to rescue Preston. It's a whole Titanic scene going on, but then she's too weak to do anything about it. Like, she cannot haul him out from the drowning basement, just cannot do anything. And so Preston is like, no, go away, save yourself. And she's like, how can you think I will ever leave you? And they're like, I love you and I love you. And I'm like, please get on with the plot. And then just when all hope is lost, another pair of extra arms comes to help Effie, and they both manage to haul him up from the drowning basement, and they manage to free him. And then Effie looks at this person, and she recognizes this person who has not shown herself previously before this, because she's only needed at this climactic moment. And Effie recognizes her from the photographs that was in Myrodin's diary, and she's like, it's you, Angharet. And so we learn that the mistress of the house, Myrodin's wife, the girl in the photo, they're all about the same woman, Angharet. And so the three of them get out of the manor, but then the storm has already reached Saltney. They cannot get down to town, there's no choice, but they go in and stay in this guest house, which is very strange that somehow the guest house is able to stay through the entire storm that's said to almost drown and sweep away everyone in the town, nearly destroys High Red Manor, and yet the three of them are somehow safe and sound inside this tiny little guest house. And the reasoning was that, she has strengthened the door, the foundation or something of that guest house with iron or something, and somehow it's supposed to hold against the storm. And so this is where the final exposition comes into light. So we learn it's Angharet, the daughter of Blackma and Myrodin's wife. You would be correct in wondering, where has this woman been in this house the entire time? But like I said, this whole story hinges on incredible plot convenience. So this woman has had no role in the story at all besides just being a plot convenience. And it's very funny, isn't it, that for a book that's claiming itself to be a so-called feminist book, the only other female character in the story is basically objectified to be a plot device. Quite properly, Angharet is simply reduced to her letters, the photograph, Myrodin's supposed grooming victim, and now to give Effie and Preston exposition and help them with their scholarship. Like, she literally has no other role, no other significance other than to be what the book needs her to be, which is basically what all the other men in the story sort of see Effie as, nothing but this pretty face. And so Angharet in the book is nothing but the plot device. And then it comes to the info dumping part. Apparently the Fairy King has been using Myrodin and Ianto as his vessels. Why? We're not told. How? We're not told. Why specifically them? We're not told. We'll just have to assume it's just for plot convenience, suppose. And then Angharad starts to tell her side of the story. She tells that since Myradin was an employee of her grandfather, her father and Myradin were friends, so it sort of began as a sort of forbidden love story. And so the way Angharad phrases it, it is implied there's mutual consent. She doesn't say particularly that, Myradin pursued her, Myradin forced himself onto her or anything. She says that she describes it as a sort of forbidden love, which implies that, she participated in this as well, that she had wanted him as much as he had wanted her, which I would assume very much because she's a very young girl at that point. And so while Angharad is talking about this, Effie cuts it and say, is it really mutual if he's twice your age? And I'm like, okay, it is going into the territory of grooming. But that's the strange part in this narration, that you have Angharad telling her story that she participated in, implying that it was mutual consent. But then you have Effie in the narration saying, no, you were a victim in all of this. But then she does imply that she was 18. So can we consider it grooming at all? It's a very grey area to go into because of the age as well. Because Angharad says that she was 18 when all of this started. It's not like Myradin had been grooming her when she was a minor. There's no point in her narration does she imply that Myradin was ceaselessly pursuing her at any point. It's that they both fell in love and the truth got out, and Black Ma and Black Ma Senior got pissed off that, Angharad is having a dalliance with this backwater poor guy who I don't think he's very educated, and they're basically pissed off about that. And that's the very strange bit about this narration, that if they were only pissed off that Angharad was in a relationship with this person who they considered was not equal to them in status or wealth, then why hand her over to Myradin at all? Because Angharad tells us that she was given to Myradin when the relationship is found out. But if their only concern was that Myradin was not on their level in education, wealth or status or anything, wouldn't it be more reasonable for them to just cut ties between the both of them, just send Myradin back to wherever he came from and keep Angharad with them? Unless, because she doesn't imply that, she had already been pregnant with their son or anything, and that's why they had no choice but to send her to Myradin. Like, that whole situation, it feels so illogical because it does sort of parallel Effie's story as well. Effie's mother got pregnant with a guy who worked under Effie's grandfather. Effie's grandfather owned a bank, and that's how they two met and had Effie. And when the grandparents found out about it, they basically just fired him off, and Effie never saw him again. The mother never saw him again. Like, nobody saw the dude. Like, if the status quo was the very reason, I would think that Black Ma Senior and Black Ma himself would just, separate them, because regardless, Angharad is their heir. Like, their more pressing concern was for her to be producing the next generation of heir for them, not to just simply give her away like she was a manuscript book. So the whole plan of contingency is very contrived. It's illogical, really, because there was no purpose for them to hand Angharad over to Myradin. Because if this was indeed grooming and they discovered that Angharad, though she may have turned 18, to them she may be still considered a child, and they see this man twice her age having her with him, that may be grounds for concern that we can go into the territory of grooming. But then that's also the illogical reason of them surrendering her to Myradin after all. Like, where is the logic in that? It doesn't make sense. Like, the whole thing feels as a plot convenience because Eva Reid couldn't find a way to relate how Black Ma's daughter went to Myradin, or how the manuscript changed then, or why there is this three-way conflict between these three men, and how Angharad herself is being featured as a victim. But I digress. So we get back to Angharad telling them that in the book Angharad is her book, that she's the one who wrote the beginning, and after her and Myradin, they had slept together the first night, when she sees in the mirror, she sees it's actually the fairy king that she slept with. And at first she thinks, she's just seeing things, and then she feels this rush to finish the book. She finishes the book, and that's basically when they are discovered, when her father discovers her and Myradin's relationship. So once Angharad has told the whole story, like she's told like what really happened between her and Myradin, what Black Ma and the chief and editor of Greenborough Books, Marlowe, had done, all their dealings, and how she's just been a victim in all of this, and once that whole thing is finished, Effie and Preston are like, we don't have any evidence to support you because, you know, the letters, Myrdin letters, the diary, the photograph. So they're like, they don't have anything else to help Angharad with. And this story is nothing if it's not plot convenience. And so remember that box that, you know, Effie just happens to save from the drowning basement. So apparently that black box, the key to that black box is held by Angharad herself, and she unlocks it, and surprise surprise, inside that black box is her diaries and her letters between herself and Myrdin, and the whole history of what had led to the publication of Angharad, the dealings between the three men. So they're like, we finally got the evidence, congratulations. So they have the evidence they need for their scholarship, and everyone gets back to care itself. So we need to tie up everything in a neat bow now. So we learn later on that Angharad, she still gets the royalties from Myrdin's other work because she is his next of kin. And so Angharad is the only book the royalties goes directly to Blackma, but Myrdin's every other work, the royalties are said to pass on to Angharad. So she has a tiny little apartment in Caer Isel. You know, Effie visits her. It's a touching moment that she gives Angharad her copy of Angharad the book for her to sign, and she feels very touched. It's a touching moment, really. Then, you know, Effie and Preston finally they present their thesis to the university, and like I've warned earlier, when the university saw Effie's name, they're like, we cannot publish this paper with a woman's name on it. Think of what people will think. And then Preston is like, you know, that's why you need to admit her as a literature student here, so that you can say this is written by students of literature school. And the dean is all like, why the fuck would I do that? And he's like, well, if you're not going to do that, I'm going to take my thesis with all of the evidence that we presented and go to a newspaper office or a journal or a tabloid or whatever it is. We'll get this published either way, with or without your help. So if you want to be the first one to present this story to everyone, you are going to admit Effie into the university. And the dean is like, okay, fine. And then Effie cuts in and says, no, you won't see any part of the evidence, Angharad's letters or diary, until you fire Master Corbenik. And they're all like, the fuck would we do that? He's one of our tenured professor. And she's like, you will do it or you won't get this evidence. And the dean was just so done with life. And so does he need to fire one of their esteemed professor? He also has to admit a woman into the literature school, and he's having a rough day. And so Effie gets what she wants, Preston gets what he wants, they're both in love, all is happy and good for them. And yeah, that's how the story ends. And the thing about the ending is that everything is neatly tied up, that it doesn't suggest we're supposed to expect a sequel or there is more to the story. It's read as a standalone. And so when Ava Reid announced there's a sequel coming for this book, my first assumption is that maybe, given how popular this book had become, that the publishers probably asked her, you know, do you have anything else you can write for this story as a sequel? Or maybe Ava Reid did have a sequel, and seeing that things that she hadn't really been able to put in this book, and seeing that, you know, it was so well received, she probably asked her agent or editor that, you know, is it possible for us to make a sequel for this? And then all the back material she's had for this story, which she couldn't have put in book 1, is now being established in book 2. That's what I feel, because when you read the ending, there's nothing in it to suggest there's any loose end that's not tied. Book 2 is called A Theory in Dreaming, and it's coming out August as well. So in addition to reading Catabasis, I also have to read this to know how much of a bigger plot convenience it's going to be to the whole story. So yeah, that was the plot of A Study in Drowning, and now I'd like to talk about specific things in the book, like the world building, the characters, the incredible plot convenience of it all. Like, I'll break them down and tell you what I liked about it, or maybe not so much. I think not so much mostly. So the first part I'd like to talk about is the incredible plot convenience that is the entire book. So like I previously had stated, this whole premise of the book, like the plot, the characters, the movement within the novel, it all hinges on incredible plot convenience. Like, the characters don't even have to do much, they just happen happen to find all of this evidence that they need. Effie happens to just have things with her just at the right moment. She just happens to not take her pill whenever it's convenient for the plot to have her and Preston really close together. It's convenient for Effie to have taken her pill and then see strange things either way to show that, maybe she is not mad, maybe this is a real thing, which I have a bone to pick with. We'll talk about this in the world building part. And I feel like the biggest plot convenience of this whole story is Effie being a student of the architecture school. Like, if we take out Effie's architecture degree in the first place, there's no difference to the plot. It's very minor details that you can easily change, because the whole point of her being an architecture student doesn't make much of an impact in the story. It's just thoroughly for plot convenience, and it's the only way Avery figured that she can get Effie from the university to Highred Manor, because it doesn't make sense why then she would go to Highred Manor in the first place, because Preston has a legitimate reason to be there, but then what other reason could Effie be there for? Because she's already established that women are not allowed to study literature in this world, so what other reason could she have to be at Highred Manor? And so she comes up with this really very convenient idea that women are not allowed to study literature, but Effie's the only woman in the architecture college, which does not make sense. And then they just happen to have an architecture designing competition that she just happens to win, and then that's how she is brought to Highred Manor. Because other than that, Effie doesn't do much. Like, instead of doing her job of redesigning the manor, she spends most of the time helping Preston find evidence to discriminate Myrodin. Another thing I find that's really annoying at the whole thing about the architecture school is, I would think that for someone like Effie, whose whole life was to be able to study literature, and then to be told that she can't, she would at least settle for something close to literature, like philosophy or history, because literature does overlap with these areas of study. But architecture has no relation at all. And she says that she chose to study in the architecture school because it's the second most prestigious, but we're not told what she's hoping to achieve by going there. She just says it's the second most prestigious, but her whole core principle is that she wants to study literature. What she's hoping to achieve is scholarship on literature, not prestige. It just so happens the literature school is the most prestigious one. But that's the thing, it would make sense if she says that, the literature school is the most prestigious and I want to be able to graduate from the most prestigious school there is. But since women are not allowed there, I will have to settle for the second most prestigious school, which is the architecture school. That makes sense. She wants the prestige. She wants her tertiary education to hold some sort of prestige for her future. But that's not the case in this story. All Effie wants to do is study literature, not prestige. So it doesn't make sense, again, why she would choose the architecture school in the first place. It does not make sense logically or rationally, but like I said, this whole thing is a plot convenience in its entirety. So other plot convenience include mostly them just finding things very, very easily, like Effie finding Preston's thesis title, Effie finding the box under the basement. Effie just so happens to be an architecture student who sees there's a hidden room in Ianto's room where they happen to find Myrodin's diary and the photograph, and then they happen to stay at Blackmar's mansion where his daughter had once stayed, and she happens to find the letters under her bed, and Effie just happens to have the hagstone in her pocket when she comes face to face with the Fairy King, and then she defeats him, and Angharet just happens to have the key to the black box that they rescue, which conveniently contains all the evidence they need for their scholarship. And yeah, that's mostly the plot convenience. Now on to the world building. So Ava Reid describes this world as a mid-century England and Wales. So now that I think about it, perhaps Lorien is supposed to be the Welsh people and Argentine the English people, but it also takes place in a fantasy world. So here's my problem with this. Like, truly, I really believe this story could have just been set as the historical fiction, because there was really no point to the whole bit with the Fairy King and the hagstones and all of this, supposed superstition surrounding this otherworldliness. Like, you can literally just take them out and the plot would just remain the same. You just replace the Fairy King with Ianto or Master Corbinic, because she stated that this is a fantasy, and that's the reason why that Fairy King is even in there. But otherwise, if it's just set as a historical fiction, the Fairy King can still play a role as a sort of euphemism for the horrors that had taken place to Effie. Like she says, she's been abandoned by a mother as a child, and maybe something horrible did happen, that it didn't have to be that the fairy king had come to take her, but something horrible did happen. She was inflicted with abuse, and that has traumatized her, but being a child, she does not have the capability to comprehend this is what had happened to me, and she invents this idea of it's a fairy king that had come to take her when her mother abandoned her, and her finger that was cut off is because of frostbite. But then she had made up the story that the fairy king took her ring finger because he did not want anyone else marrying her or such. The whole premise of the folklore and the superstition can work as a sort of euphemism for the real life horrors that has happened to Effie, and it can relate to what Angharad herself has experienced, because Effie says that this particular book that she's written, Angharad, is what she has felt related to compared to any other work that she feels truly seen. And because Angharad herself has been on the receiving end of some of this abuse, so they can relate. It's a shared connection between them, and it could have worked like that. It didn't necessarily had to be a fantasy in relation to the fairy king and the hagstones and everything else being real. And by the end of the story, Effie comes to realize that maybe people had been telling her that all of this delusion and manic was really the results of childhood trauma that she had somehow blocked away, and had invented the story that this is what happened to her. And when she uncovers that is when she finally confronts her trauma. She comes to accept that this is what had happened to me, and I've come to terms with it. And people may not have believed me when I had been saying that it was the fairy king who took me, he's the one who did this to my finger and everything. And now when I tell the truth of what happened, people will have to listen because I am telling the truth. So it could have worked as a message tells us the story of a survivor, someone who's been through this very horrible thing. And it's a good message to have in the story, but it gets really lost within this world building of it being set as a fantasy, and so we don't know which side to lean on. I'm not saying that Effie's entire experience is to be dismissed, that this is because on the account that it's set in a fantasy setting, but I am just saying that it could have made a bigger impact or had a more nuance to the story had it been set as a historical fiction. Eva Reid herself in an interview had said, quote, "The book is about mental illness and the intersection of gender and ableism when it comes to historic treatment of mentally ill women who were institutionalized, lobotomized, locked away and tortured in padded cells." End quote. Okay, if you want to talk about this, then why set your story as a fantasy where even the most outrageous thing can be real? Also, it doesn't give credibility to Effie's character at all, because the whole point of her schizophrenia is real and that she takes the pill for it. You are trying to make a point that, she does suffer from mental illness, but then if it's all real, it completely negates the point you're trying to make about mental illness, because if the fantasy element is real, then there's no point of intersectionality that we can talk about, because then that would negate that the mental illness within the scope of the fantasy world doesn't exist, because what Effie is seeing is real. Therefore, it means that she is not suffering from any mental illness except for trauma. If you want to talk about women and their mental health and how they're often neglected, it is more important to have that story rooted in reality rather than fantasy, because then if the fairy king has been real all along, so then what's the point of Effie taking those pills, of Effie dealing with her mental health, thinking that she is crazy this whole time? The other part of the world building that really got on my nerves was this selective sexism within the larger expanse of the universe that includes the literature college and the architecture college. Like I've mentioned before, that it's such a strange selective process that women are not allowed to study some things but they're allowed to study other things. It's very contrived, and I feel as if that Eva Reid wanted to make a statement about Effie being good enough to get into the literature college, but she can't because women are not allowed to study in the literature college, so she has to go into the second best, which then she, for plot convenience, made it into the architecture college, and so that's why Effie goes goes. But you would think that if this is a world where men are looking to oppress women, it would be stated as a mandatory law that if women are not allowed to study something, they are surely not going to be allowed to study anything else, because if you're regarded as a second-class citizen, you're not going to be allowed opportunities the same as the men are. And it is implied in the text as well that Effie's roommate and her girlfriend, they go to a music college or a music observatory or something like that, but we're not told is under the same university that they all go to. But it is implied like they all sort of know each other. It's very vague, it's not really described, and so we're not given a proper sense of how tertiary education system in this world works. Like, why specifically women are not allowed to study in the literature college, but Effie gets to go into architecture college and she is the only woman in there, but her friend and her girlfriend are able to study music. So what is the hierarchy? Is it just the liberal arts that women are not allowed to study? What about STEM subjects? Architecture is, I would assume, part of art and design. Is art and design allowed for women? All Eva says is that is common misogyny. Women are not allowed to study literature. She doesn't say why, but Effie is allowed to study architecture and her roommate and her girlfriend are able to study music. So what is she trying to say? And the last annoying part of the world building is this apparent war between Lyre and Argentine. We are just told they are warring. We're not told why they're warring, for what they're warring, what is the political landscape of which the war is taking place. Like, Effie is just racist to Preston for like at least 40% of the book until she makes a 180 and falls in love with him for God knows why. But we are not told under what circumstances this war is happening or how long has it been going on. Like Eva does it inspires mid-century England and Wales. So is she taking basis on actual historical accounts that have happened? Like, we are not told. As we all know, 70% of this book taken up by Preston and Effie's flirting and nothing else. So the world building cannot compete with the primary love story, so it has to take second place. So the next topic I'd like to touch upon is the whole feminism that's running through the book. It's not very subtle, that's all I'll say. It's very in-your-face kind of feminism. You know, all the men in the book are misogynist except for Preston. All the men only see Effie as someone who has good looks and they don't value her for anything else except for Preston. And you don't even get any contrast to another character compared to Preston. Like, Preston is just not like the other boys. He is the perfect boy for Effie. Like, he sees through her all the time. He explains to her all the things that he sees and knows about her that she herself doesn't realize. He's immediately just drawn to her and falls in love, and Preston is just not like the other boys. And also, it's a strange thing that for this entirety of the novel, we don't get any other significant female characters. We only have the men, and they're just there to be the misogynist. But we don't get any other female character. Like I said, Angharad is only there to be the plot device. She has no other relevance outside of just being the plot device for the book. We get few mentions of Effie's roommate and her girlfriend, but that's not the priority here. Then we get few mentions of Effie's mother, who I believe has like such a rich character, even though we don't meet her, we don't know anything about her and her relationship with Effie. I want to learn about that, but we don't know anything about that. And there's literally no other female characters. None. It felt as if there was any other female character that was introduced in this book compared to Effie, they would outshine her like quite properly. It's a very strange stance to take for a book that prides itself on, you know, talking about this feminist trait. One of the end goals for Effie is that she finally gets a boy and that she finally has sex. In addition to being a literature student, this book is not about Effie learning to differentiate fiction with reality. It's not Effie learning to fix her relationship with her mother. It's not Effie trying to understand that it's not a singular person who is at fault for how the misogyny works. It's an entire system built upon the patriarchy. It's not Effie learning that people are all shades of grey. There's no good people or bad people. Everyone has good and bad in them. And men especially, they're not all misogynist. You have perfect little Preston. It's not Effie learning about the intricacies of living or how she's come to deal with her trauma or how she's better learned about herself. No, this is mostly just Effie getting the guy, getting into literature school, and in the story, not a virgin. I mean, I understand because it's a YA novel, and that's how it's written to be sounded. But we could have at least workshopped it a little better, or at least make it a bit more subtle, because there's a scene in the book, very early chapters on, that a boy is complimenting Effie on her good looks, because that's all the man does in the books, that they just compliment her on her looks. And so he's complimenting her on her looks, and Effie goes into this thinking process that sort of doesn't make sense, but it's supposed to be there as a way to prove that this book is talking about feminism. And so she goes into this train of thought where she's thinking, if I agree with him to say that yes, I do have good looks, that I am pretty, he's gonna think I am vain and shallow just like any other girl. But then if I deny his compliment, he's gonna think I'm playing coy or being naive about it. It's a very feminist sort of critique about how women are viewed through the male gaze, but it does not make sense of the context when you read it, because Effie's the only woman studying in that university, and how is she supposed to know about these feminism traits when she has never in the entirety of the book interacted with any other female scholar to know this is what is happening? If we had just made the sentence that Effie doesn't know how to react to such a situation because she's been complimented before, and sometimes when she agrees to the compliment that some people don't like it, but if she does not agree to the compliment, they also don't like it. So you have that subtlety that it's critiquing this sort of, women are viewed for their looks, but they cannot accept or deny that claim on the account it's being given by a man. So you have that subtlety to show that this is what is happening, and yet Effie goes into this whole train of thought of this feminism critique when there's no other women in that college for her to actually play off, even know that this is what is happening to her. She's literally the only woman among men the whole time. We don't see her interact with anyone else except for a brief interact with her roommate, and they don't even go to the same university. So how does she understand this is what is happening to her? Like, where does she even get the capacity to understand this is what these men are doing to her? The critique that she is being put upon, like, how does she even articulate this very complex train of thought in a university where she's the only female? Like, I don't get that point. You would think that because she's the only woman in this whole school, she would be more inclined to follow the mass majority, because Effie, we learn, is not someone who is very confident in her own stance or in her own abilities or nothing. She is very timid and very anxiety prone and impulsive. Like, she is the kind of person that does not like to stand out, and so I would assume that being the only woman in this university, she would be more inclined to agree to some of the misogynistic comments that are made. She thinks, because she's among this man day in and day out, regardless if she has a female roommate. And maybe that could have been a great dialogue to have, that because she's the only woman in this college, she is prone to agreeing with some of these misogynistic comments, and when she brings this out to have a conversation with her roommate or any other woman, then you can say it's a dialogue. This is what the message is trying to get across to the reader. But Effie, throughout the entire book, is completely just 100% aware of feminism, its critique. Like, literally all the men in the story are just misogynistic and sexist, and they don't do anything except comments on her look. Like, that's all that they see about her. We don't get any other female perspective. Effie doesn't even interact with any other female. We only get Angharad at the very end of the story. Like, if Effie had been able to have even a brief few scene with Angharad when she first meets her, and she thinks that this old woman is being standoffish, she's being very mean to her on the account that Effie is young and bold. Like, we can see this is what the ideas that she has been surrounded with, being the only female in the college. And then she learns what really happened to Angharad, and what she has been trying to do this whole time is not insult or condemn Effie in any way, but she's been trying to protect her from her son Ianto this whole time. It could have been a great conversation to have. It could have been a great way to put on this message about feminism. But Effie throughout the book is she's just incredibly aware of feminism 101. The moment she sees the girl in the photograph, she's like, she's a victim just like me, regardless if the relationship is consensual or not. She doesn't have any context to what really happened, but she just knows this woman is a victim because she looks just like her, and Effie herself is a victim. So of course people who look like her are a victim, and she gives this narrative of everything just being black and white. Men bad, women good. Men take advantage of women, women are victim. That's basically the message of the story. It's not that people people are every shade of grey. Some people, yes, they do use their charms to get through society because that's how the system has already been put in place by these men. Some women have the principle, but some women are too caught up in their own principle to see the bigger picture. Some women are making do with what they have, so they have no choice but to resort to this, but that doesn't make them any less feminist than you are. There's so many shades of characters we can explore, and a book that's highly speaking about feminism, it does not have a lot of female character. And then there's another part in the very beginning when Effie goes back to her dorm and her roommate, and she complains about how there's always spiders in the bathroom, and every time there's spiders she gets her roommate to squish them, and they name the spiders. They killed Colin this week and they killed Dennis next week and whatever such. So the roommate's girlfriend, she asks why are these spiders always named after men, and Effie's roommate comments that it feels more satisfying to squish them then. And I'm like, what is the message is trying to say here? Like, do these people not have fathers or brothers or uncles or grandfathers or anyone who like they're fond of or they think are a good person? Like, are all men on equal state that they're all bad person? Like, that's what it feels like Eva Reid is trying to say, that there are no good men in this world. They're just horrible men and women are the victim. And I think that's the critique that Eva Reid is trying to give. And I'm like, feminism is not just trying to hate on the men. Feminism is the idea that women are no less than men in intellect, is this equality that you cannot just dismiss women or treat women as a second-class citizen, and because they're women they have to be considered the lesser sex. And that's what feminism is trying to critique, that women have been dismissed, overlooked on the account of their sex. It's not just men being horrible people, men being sexist, men being misogynist. It's a lot of things have contributed to the misogyny. It's not just men. There are women too who grow up with this internalized misogyny, who till this day, some people don't realize that's what it is, but because they've been grown up to this their whole life, they cannot realize this is what it is. They think that, women, they should be married and be household providers rather than go out to work and stuff. That's all internalized misogyny, but they don't. And that's what contributes to so much of, talks around feminism and equality and such. But this book is trying to portray it as men are all misogynist and sexist, women are all victims. That's the feminism is trying to teach. And it's also constantly mentioned or constantly implied that Effie is given the privilege that she does in the university on the accounts of her good looks. I understand the rhetoric of what it's trying to say, that it's a critique that, all these men see are her good looks, but we don't see what actually befalls the women that are not blessed with good looks. Like, are they given the same privilege as Effie? Are they treated any differently? How are they in contrast to Effie? Do they internalize the same misogyny that they think, Effie is only getting this privilege through her good looks, like how the other men think of her, that they think she is shallow and vain just like the other men do? Like, we don't have that contrast, or we don't have the comparison to make how is Effie treated differently to other women. Like, we're just so focused on Effie, like nothing else matters, and that Effie becomes the very paragon of feminism and virtue within this book itself. We do not get any other interaction or any other characters that are given who face the same thing that Effie faces, but then they are not given the privilege that she is on the account of her good looks. Like, we don't get any of that contrast. It's just Effie is the only victim in the story, and it's only Effie that we are concerned about, not the message of the feminism that the book is trying to get across. So that's about the apparent feminism of the book. And now I'd like to talk about the characters. I mean, I've talked in length about all of them, basically. Like, Effie is she's just there. Preston is not like the other guys. Angharad is plot device. And Ianto is just reduced to crazy bipolar guy. But the character I want to talk about is Myradin, because the way Eva Reid wrote him is so clearly set up for us to view him as a bad person by the end of the novel. Because, of course, if Myradin had turned out to be a good person, then there was no purpose for the rhetoric of the whole feminism in this book. So Myradin has to be a bad person in order for us to find out the truth that the person who had actually written Angharad is a woman. Because of course, a man couldn't write such a strong female independent character. Of course, they have no idea what a strong female independent character is or independent woman is. All they know is misogyny and sexism. It's also a very strange statement to make that just because you're a horrible person, you cannot make anything good. But we have evidence historically that horrible men have produce good works that till this day we consider classics. Like, there have been men who were misogynist, who were sexist, but yet is hailed as some of the greatest minds of their century or greatest thinkers, and their work, their book, anything that they've done is still relegated to the pinnacle of human existence. So it's not that it's a very strange statement this book is making, that just because you are a horrible person, you cannot make anything good. But if you're a woman, then everything is permitted. Just because he's a horrible person, it means that he couldn't have written a book. Like, he's written every other book in his collection. It's just that Angharat happens to be the most popular and is the most contested of the authorship. It's not that he's never written any other book. I would rather have had this story portray Myriddin, a horrible person, but he is the author who wrote this book. Or either he's not this horrible person, but he just has done this one terrible thing as passing his wife's book as his own. Like, at least we get some complexities within that story. How then are we supposed to articulate our feelings? And Effie herself, how does that change her relationship with the source material that she has been dedicated to her whole life? Like, what does that inform her about herself, about what really happens in the world? And that's the thing. In contrast to setting up Myriddin to be this horrible person, she could have just let Myriddin be exactly how Effie had imagined him. Because when she reads Angharat, she thinks, this is the person who wrote Angharat, so he has to be this kind, this wonderful, this gentlemanly person. And when she does learn about Myriddin, he's exactly as she imagines him to be. And yet we learn that he is not the one who wrote Angharat, it's his wife. And so we still get the idea, although Angharat is the one who had written the book, it's not a contest of this person being somewhat different from who Effie had imagined him to be, because the book had been written by the woman who had felt the same about her husband. This is someone she clearly loved, someone she clearly adored, someone she left everything for. But then he does this one horrible thing where he took her work and passed it off in his own. And so we get a more nuanced character that, yes, this man is this kind, loving, gentlemanly person who very much loved his wife, but he's also done this terrible thing where he passed it off as his own. So it's not all just black and white. It's not just he's a horrible person, that's why he does this thing. Good people do happen to do horrible things. No one is just entirely goodness or evil. Everyone is shades of grey. Instead of just collectively saying men bad, they are the abusers, the oppressors, women good, they are the oppressed and they are the victims. I know Eva Reid can write this because she's written this incredible complicated relationship of Effie and her mother. Like, we clearly see that her mother has difficulty accepting Effie because she's a child born out of wedlock, and she's also been this very difficult child to raise. And Effie acknowledges that too, that she loves her mother, but she's also done this horrible thing to her that has led her to be the victim of the fairy king, that this is something she has to live with for the rest of her life. But she also clearly realizes that, her mother did love her enough to come back for her. She did love her enough to want her to live a normal life. That's why she brings her to the doctors, and that's why she gets her medicated and all these things. Like, she is able to write this sort of complicated relationship. But since Myriddin is a man, he has to be an old sexist misogynist. He cannot have any other traits of character to himself. I read an interview that Eva Reid gave that the topics that are brought about in this book reflects her own experience. And so I would think that the main point of this story is about Effie and her journey and how she moves past the trauma, how she comes to accept a lot of things. We would spend more time talking about, Effie's difficulties, her relationship with her mother, her status as a woman in this society, how she has to navigate it. Like, we don't take the time to really understand why she is the way she is. But then when you read the book, that all seems secondary to the primary focus of Effie and Preston's love story. I'm not sure if I mentioned it earlier, but this whole story is written as a secret history, alternate timeline, self-insert, fanfic, Henry Winter Girly, AU. I'm not making this part up. Like Ava Reid herself has said that Preston is based on Henry Winter. If you know a Henry Winter girly, you know Henry Winter girly, because Henry Winter girlies think he is the ultimate virtuous man in that story. He is this complex moral character. He is the epitome of goodness in that book, and Preston is just a really cheap version of that. And speaking about Henry Winter, I want to also touch about the romance aspect of the story, and the point of the love story within this novel is not about the characters learning about themselves and figuring about themselves, or learning to be better for the other person, or choosing to love the other person despite their flaws and all, or even having to, learn to sacrifice something of their own for someone they love. It is not about that. The point of that love story is having sex. That's literally it. You read nearly any YA novel, the point of the whole romantasy genre is for the spicy scenes. Like that's purely the point of that. And this is what has culminated in the collectiveness to understand this is what love story is. It's not about loving a person, it's about banging that person. That's the end goal here. So because the story has to end with sex, because otherwise what's the point? You fool this whole story about the character and they've almost at the end there, but if they don't have sex, then what's the point? There's no point to the love story anyway. So at least that's what these stories are trying to say. So those are my thoughts on Studying Drowning. The story could have worked. It's not a bad story. It has some really meaningful dialogue and ideas, and it has some really good plot points. It's just I wish that it could have been workshopped a little better to have more depth and more impact. Let me explain what I mean. The story can still start off the way it does. The only difference is that Effie is not a student at the university, and in this world, the mandatory law is that women are not allowed to go into tertiary education, are considered as a second-class citizen, and they're not given the equal opportunity that the men do. And all Effie wants is to study literature. And at that point, Emrys Myrdin had already been dead for 6 months, and once the Sleeper Museum has already obtained his body, the university could have put out a competition, the same competition that she goes for, that architecture thing. It could have been a competition to write a paper or a tribute for Myrdin, to list out all the accomplishments that he's achieved, the many works that are beloved, something to commemorate him on his passing and his reinstation to the Sleeper Museum. And so Effie sees this. She's like, I cannot study literature, but this is the one thing I can do. I have this opportunity. And so she submits her proposal, her writing, to the competition. It's only said that it's only available to students from the literature school, but then she disguises her name and she sends it in anyway. And because she tells us she knows Myrdin's work from book to book, she knows it by heart, and it's not surprising to see that her paper is picked, but they cannot find this student in the literature school. And so that is when Effie goes and she reveals the truth that I wrote this paper, I'm the one who wrote this. Maybe at first they don't believe her, and then as she tells them that I wrote this, they start to believe her. And because they're all misogynist men, they think they cannot publish a paper written by a woman. They're like, we cannot do this would be unbecoming of us. And so they disregard her paper and they pick the second best paper, and that is Preston. And so Effie feels like she's been cheated out of this because it's a competition, and she had managed to win that competition compared to all the other men, to prove that it's not a matter of gender that is discriminating one's ability to study literature. That proves a point. So Preston's paper gets chosen, and the Myrdin estate, Ianto, he invites Preston over to Highred Manor to congratulate him and sort of show him all his father's other work so that it can be put together as this tribute for him. And Effie learns this, and she's like, Effie can still be the same character, but she feels that this is the one thing I can do. It's the only thing I can do, and if I don't try, at first she feels defeated that nobody is acknowledging her paper, but then she thinks that that, this is the one thing I was able to do, and because my paper is chosen, it shows that, I have this capability to do this. And she thinks that, maybe if she goes and explains to Myrodin's son Iento that it is actually her paper that won the competition, but then the university won't publish because she's a woman, she thinks that, she has a chance if she goes to Iento and tells him that, I have written this paper and it's filled with all of these wonderful things that I've read from Myrodin's work. We could have had that whole dialogue is the motive that takes her from Kara Isel to Hayret Manor, and then the plot can just continue as it does. She can be at Hayret Manor, she and Preston can be there. Effie reveals the truth, it's actually my paper that got chosen, but they refuse to publish it because I'm a woman. And so Iento tells them, okay, write me another tribute paper, something that is outstanding, and I'll let you stay here for a week. By the end of it, I'll choose the winner and I'll make sure the estate publishes that. And then Effie's like, this is my chance to prove myself again. And so the plot can basically be the same. It can still be this disrepute, crumbling place of a manor and creepy things are happening, but at least Effie is doing something she thinks that is the one thing she's able to do. And at least it shows a rivalry between Effie and Preston, because that's the whole premise of how this book is marketed, is this dark academia rivals to lovers story. But there was no rivalry in it at all because they don't study the same thing and there's no academia. So, and the plot can go on pretty much the same. She's writing her tribute to Myrodin and then she learns that Preston is not actually there to pay tribute to Myrodin. He's actually there to question the authorship of her book Angharet. He's the one who noticed first this, but when he brought it up to the university, they shut it down. They don't want him to expose this truth, and he's like, no, I have to do this. And that's why he entered the competition, to be able to expose Myrodin for not being the true author of Angharet. But then his paper doesn't get picked, Effie's does. But by some miracle, he gets into this position because of the privilege he has of being a literature student, also of being a man. And now he's like, I have this chance too. I can expose Myrodin for who he truly is. So we have a proper conflict between these two main characters, and they're rivaling over this author who is basically mysterious to us. So we learn about the author through them. We have on both ends of the spectrum, we have Effie who clearly idolizes this person and tells so many wonderful things about this author, and then we have Preston on the other hand, who's like, he says that it's impossible this person could have written this because he was not very well educated. Most of his early work was not published this way. There's inconsistency with the themes, and why is only Angharet the most famous work? It could have been that sort of conflict and argument that they're trying to build upon this scholarship under Myrodin, and then creepy stuffs happen in the manor itself, and then we have the mysterious mistress. Like, it could have been worked out this way. And so between this conflict and this argument that they're having with each other, that they are the one who knows the author best, that's when they stumble upon like secrets upon secrets. Like, maybe he's not always been who he says he was. Maybe Effie is right, but maybe Preston is also right, and so they sort of, come together to learn who the author really is and what really happened behind the writing of Angharet. And then in the end, it could have been that they decided that instead of writing a tribute commemorating Myrodin for what he does, they will write instead about the true authorship of Angharet herself. And then they present the paper together, and you have this incredible coherent storyline highlighting how their relationship begins, how this whole thing develops to the end. Like, it could have been worked out this way, because what I've described also ties into the kind of theme that Eva Reid is trying to highlight. Effie isn't allowed to study literature, and Angharet's work is passed off as a husband. So you have the commonality of the two characters. They're not allowed to do what they want, and so they're being passed off or given opportunity to the men, which sort of ties their story together. There's parallel things that's running side by side with each other. So that is my thought on A Study in Drowning, and yeah, I had fun talking this out. And if you've listened all this way, thank you. But seriously, thank you for listening, and I'll wait for the second book to come out and then see if it's an even bigger plot convenience than the first book. I'm also waiting for Catabasis to come out, which is still a long way to go. There's one more video I want to do, and it's a recent book that I read, which very similar to a concept of a book I read a long time ago, somewhere in I think 2019, I guess. So yeah, and this book is a duology, and the second book came out somewhere in end of January, if I'm not mistaken. And so I read the book, and the whole thing just felt like one big weird fever dream. So I will see when I get to do that video, because already this one took me so long to edit that I'm just dreading if I'm going to do another video and I have to edit. And so we'll see how it goes. If there's no video, please don't despair. There will be one in coming out in August for Cataverses, so I'll see what I can manage. But that's it for now, and thank you for listening.